A broke waitress made one simple hand gesture to a billionaire's mother. What happened next left the entire restaurant in tears and changed her life forever. By the end of this story, you'll understand why sometimes the most powerful words are the ones we never speak out loud. Stay with me because this moment, this one beautiful moment, proves that kindness is a language everyone can understand. Welcome to Voice of Granny. While you are here, please hit the subscribe button and comment your view on the story and where you're watching from. You know, sometimes life puts us in places we never imagined we'd be. And sometimes in those very places, we discover that the smallest acts of kindness can change everything. Let me tell you about a young woman named Grace. Grace was 23 years old, and if you passed her on the street, you probably wouldn't notice her. She had that kind of quiet presence, the kind that blends into the background. Her clothes were simple, always neat but never fancy. Her hair was usually pulled back in a practical ponytail. And her eyes, well, her eyes carried stories that most people never bothered to ask about. Grace had just started working at the Grand Pearl restaurant, one of those places where everything costs more than most people make in a week. You know the type. Crystal glasses that catch the light just right. White tablecloths so crisp they look like they've never been used. Waiters who move like dancers, carrying plates worth more than rent. It was the kind of place where movie stars celebrated birthdays, where business deals worth millions happened over dessert, where people wore watches that cost more than cars. For Grace, every shift felt like walking on eggshells. She'd only been there for 3 weeks, and every day she worried about making a mistake. What if she spilled something on a guest? What if she forgot an order? What if she wasn't fast enough, polite enough, invisible enough? But here's the thing about Grace. She wasn't always this quiet, this careful. There was a time when she laughed louder, dreamed bigger, smiled easier. That was before life taught her some hard lessons. That was before everything changed. Grace grew up in a small apartment on the edge of the city, the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone's business. Her father left when she was 11. Just packed a bag one Tuesday morning and never came back. No explanation, no goodbye. Just gone. Her mother, bless her heart, worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat. Morning shifts at the bakery, evening shifts cleaning offices. Grace barely saw her some weeks. But Grace wasn't alone. She had her little brother, Tommy. Tommy was 8 years younger than Grace, and he was born deaf. Completely deaf. Couldn't hear a single sound. Not birds singing, not music playing, not even his own laughter. But Tommy was sunshine in human form. Always smiling, always curious, always finding joy in the smallest things. When Tommy was born, Grace was only 8 years old herself. But she made a decision that day, looking at her baby brother through the hospital window. She decided she would learn his language. She would make sure he never felt alone in his silent world. So Grace learned sign language. She practiced every single day. Her fingers learned to dance, to speak, to sing without sound. By the time Tommy was 5, they had their own secret world, a world where words flew through the air on fingertips and love needed no voice to be heard. Those years with Tommy were the best years of Grace's life. They'd sit together doing homework, his hands asking questions, her hands answering. They'd watch movies with subtitles, laughing at the same jokes. They'd make up their own signs for silly things, creating a language that belonged only to them. But life, as it often does, had other plans. When Tommy was 12 and Grace was 20, Tommy got sick. Really sick. The kind of sick that doctors talk about in hushed voices and use words that sound like they're from another language. Grace spent every moment she could at the hospital, her hands telling Tommy stories, promising him everything would be okay, even when she wasn't sure herself. Tommy fought hard. He fought for 8 months. But in the end, the sickness was stronger. The day Tommy died, a part of Grace died too. The part that believed the world was fair. The part that believed love could conquer anything. The part that knew how to be loud and joyful and free. After Tommy passed away, Grace's mother fell apart. The grief was too much. She'd already been holding on by a thread, and losing Tommy cut that thread completely. She started drinking, started missing work, started disappearing into her own pain. Grace, barely 21, found herself alone in a world that suddenly felt too big and too cold. That's when Grace learned what it meant to truly survive. She took whatever job she could find. Retail stores, coffee shops, cleaning offices just like her mother used to. She sent money home when she could, hoping her mother would use it for food instead of bottles. She moved into a tiny room in a shared apartment with 3 strangers. She learned to make meals out of rice and whatever was on sale. She learned to walk everywhere to save bus fare. She learned to be invisible because being seen hurt too much. And somehow, through a stroke of luck or maybe destiny, she found herself applying for a job at the Grand Pearl restaurant. She almost didn't go to the interview. What business did someone like her have in a place like that? But rent was due, and her savings were gone, and sometimes you do things not because you believe in them, but because you have no other choice. The manager, a stern woman with perfect posture and sharp eyes, looked Grace up and down during the interview. Grace was sure she wouldn't get the job. But then the manager said something unexpected. She said, "You have kind eyes. That matters here more than you'd think." And just like that, Grace became a waitress at the fanciest restaurant she'd ever set foot in. Now, 3 weeks later, Grace still felt like she didn't belong. But she showed up every day. She smiled politely. She carried plates carefully. She blended into the background, just another face in the elegant machinery of luxury dining. She had no idea that everything was about to change. That one afternoon, one table, one moment of recognition would crack open something inside her that she thought had died with Tommy. That kindness, even after being buried under grief and hardship, could still bloom in the most unexpected places. It was a Thursday afternoon when Grace's life changed forever. Thursdays at the Grand Pearl were usually quieter than weekends, but still busy enough to keep everyone moving. The lunch rush was winding down, and Grace was refilling water glasses when the manager approached her with that look, the one that meant something important was happening. "Grace," the manager said quietly, "I need you to take table 7. It's a VIP reservation. Real estate developer and his mother. Very important guests. Can you handle it?" Grace's heart immediately started racing. VIP tables were usually given to the senior waiters, the ones who'd been there for years and knew exactly how to handle demanding customers. Why was she being asked? Was this a test? Was she going to mess this up and lose her job? But she nodded, smoothing down her apron with trembling hands. "Yes, ma'am. I can handle it." "Good," the manager said. "They're arriving in 5 minutes. Table 7 is by the window. Make sure everything is perfect." Grace rushed to table 7 and checked everything 3 times. Silverware aligned perfectly. Wine glasses spotless. Napkins folded into elegant triangles. Fresh flowers in the center. Everything had to be exactly right. When the guests arrived, Grace understood why this was considered such an important table. The man who walked in first was tall, maybe in his mid-40s, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Grace made in 6 months. His shoes shined like mirrors. His watch caught the light with every movement. Everything about him screamed wealth and power. This was Julian Rivera, one of the biggest real estate developers in the country. Grace had seen his face in newspapers, always standing in front of some new building or development project, always looking serious and untouchable. But it was the woman with him who really caught Grace's attention. Julian's mother, walking beside him with careful, measured steps. She was probably in her 70s, dressed in a beautiful lavender dress with a pearl necklace. Her silver hair was styled elegantly. She had the kind of face that must have been stunning when she was younger, and even now carried a gentle beauty. But there was something else Grace noticed immediately, something in the way she moved, in the way she held herself, in the way she watched people's lips when they spoke. Julian helped his mother into her chair with practiced ease, the kind of gesture that comes from years of looking after someone you love. As Grace approached the table, her palms sweating, she heard Julian speak to his mother, leaning in close and speaking clearly, deliberately, the way you do when you want to make sure someone can hear you. Grace stepped up to the table, her prepared greeting ready. "Good afternoon, and welcome to the Grand Pearl. My name is Grace, and I'll be taking care of you today. Can I start you off with something to drink?" Julian nodded and was about to speak when his mother turned to look at Grace, smiling politely but not responding. Grace saw Julian lean toward his mother again, repeating the question slowly. That's when Grace noticed it, a small, discreet hearing aid tucked behind the older woman's ear, barely visible beneath her silver hair. Something shifted inside Grace's chest. A recognition. A memory. A feeling she hadn't felt in 2 years. She watched as Julian patiently repeated questions to his mother, watched as his mother tried to read his lips, watched as she smiled and nodded, but clearly struggled to catch every word. Grace saw the slight frustration in the woman's eyes, not at her son, but at the situation. She'd seen that exact same look on Tommy's face 100 times, that feeling of being just slightly outside the conversation, always working twice as hard to keep up with a world that moved too fast. And then Grace saw something else. She saw the careful way Julian ordered for both of them, how he'd glance at his mother to make sure she was comfortable, how he positioned himself so she could see his face clearly. She saw love there. The same kind of love Grace had felt for Tommy. The kind that doesn't need words to exist. Other waiters might not have noticed these small details. They might have just taken the order and moved on, uncomfortable with the extra effort required. But Grace noticed everything. Because she'd lived it. Because for 12 years, she'd been the one leaning in close, making sure Tommy could see her hands, making sure he never felt left out or less than. Julian ordered sparkling water for himself and asked what his mother would like. The older woman looked at the menu, then up at her son, trying to read his lips in the restaurant's ambient noise. "What was that, darling?" she asked, her voice having that particular quality of someone who can't quite monitor their own volume. Grace felt her heart squeeze. And before she even realized what she was doing, before she could second-guess herself or worry about breaking protocol, her hands moved. She stepped slightly closer to the table, making sure the older woman could see her clearly. Then Grace raised her hands and signed, slowly and clearly. "Would you prefer still water or sparkling water?" The effect was immediate and electric. Julian's mother's eyes went wide, her hand flying to her chest as if Grace's signs had physically touched her heart. Her mouth opened in surprise, and then slowly, tears began to fill her eyes. Time seemed to stop. The entire restaurant, with all its noise and movement, faded into the background. In that moment, there were only two people in the world, Grace and this woman, connected by a language born of love and necessity. The older woman's hands began to move, shaking slightly with emotion. She signed back. "You know sign language?" Grace nodded, her own eyes beginning to sting with tears she'd been holding back for 2 years. She signed. "Yes. My brother was deaf." "Was?" the woman signed, her face full of immediate understanding and sympathy. Grace's hands trembled as she signed. "He passed away 2 years ago." Julian Rivera sat frozen in his chair, watching something he'd never expected to see. His mother, Catherine, was crying. But these weren't tears of sadness or frustration, the kind he'd seen too many times over the years. These were tears of pure joy, of recognition, of feeling suddenly seen in a way she hadn't been in so long. Catherine's hands were moving rapidly now, signing to Grace with growing excitement. "What was your brother's name?" Grace's throat tightened, but she signed back. "Tommy. He was 12 when he died." "I'm so sorry," Catherine signed, her face full of genuine compassion. Then she added, "But he taught you something beautiful. Thank you for using it to speak to me." Grace had to blink back her own tears. Here she was, supposed to be taking an order, supposed to be professional and efficient and invisible. Instead, she was having the first real conversation in sign language she'd had since Tommy died. And it felt like coming home after being lost for years. Julian finally found his voice. "Excuse me," he said, his voice rough with emotion he was clearly trying to control. "You know sign language?" Grace turned to him, suddenly remembering where she was, what she was supposed to be doing. "Yes, sir. I'm sorry, I should have just taken your order. I didn't mean to." "No," Julian interrupted, shaking his head. "Please don't apologize. You have no idea, nobody has ever." He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. This man who commanded boardrooms and negotiated million-dollar deals. "Nobody has ever done that for my mother before. Not in a restaurant. Not anywhere outside of home." Catherine reached out and gently touched Grace's hand, then signed. "Please, can you stay and talk with us? Just for a moment." Grace glanced around nervously. The manager was watching from across the room, probably wondering why she was taking so long at one table. Other tables needed attention. She had a job to do. But when she looked back at Catherine's hopeful face, at Julian's grateful expression, she couldn't say no. "Let me take your order first," Grace signed to Catherine directly. "And then I can talk while you wait for your food." Catherine's face lit up like sunrise. She signed back, "You choose for me. Whatever you think is good. I trust you." Grace took their order, making sure to sign everything to Catherine, explaining each dish, asking about dietary restrictions, treating her not as someone to work around, but as the guest she was. And Catherine responded with such enthusiasm, such joy, asking questions about the food, making jokes, her hands dancing through the air with the kind of freedom that comes from finally being understood. As Grace put in their order and returned to the table, Catherine immediately began signing again. "How old are you, dear?" 23, Grace signed back. "So young to have experienced such loss," Catherine signed, her eyes sad. "Tell me about Tommy." And Grace did. Standing there in the middle of the Grand Pearl restaurant, supposed to be working, supposed to be invisible, Grace told a stranger about her brother. She told Catherine about how Tommy loved dinosaurs, how he'd collect toy dinosaurs and line them up by size. She told her about how Tommy would laugh silently, his whole body shaking with joy. She told her about the secret signs they'd invented, the ones that were just theirs. She told her about Tommy's last days, how she'd signed stories to him in the hospital, how the last thing she'd signed to him was, "I love you," and how he'd signed it back with weak, trembling hands. Catherine cried as Grace signed, and Julian sat watching both of them, his own eyes red. When Grace finished, Catherine stood up from her chair, and before Grace could step back, the older woman pulled her into a tight hug. Grace stiffened at first, not used to being touched, not used to this kind of openness. But then she melted into it, hugging this stranger who understood her grief in a way no one else had. When Catherine pulled back, she signed, "Tommy lives on through you. Every time you sign, he's still speaking. Do you understand that?" Grace nodded, unable to hold back her tears anymore. She'd spent 2 years feeling like Tommy was just gone, erased from the world. But Catherine was right. Every sign Grace made carried Tommy's memory. His language was still alive in her hands. The afternoon continued, but it was unlike any shift Grace had ever worked. She kept returning to table 7 between other tables, signing with Catherine, laughing at her jokes, sharing stories. Catherine told Grace about growing up deaf in a time when sign language wasn't widely accepted, about the isolation she'd felt, about how Julian had learned to sign when he was just a little boy so his mother would never feel alone. "He's a good son," Catherine signed, glancing at Julian with such love. "Sometimes too serious, too worried about business. But he's never forgotten that I matter more than any deal." Julian, who'd been watching this entire exchange, finally spoke to Grace directly. "My mother has always felt left out," he said quietly. "Even at family dinners, even with people who love her. They try, but they don't really understand. They get impatient. They talk around her instead of to her. She's learned to smile through it, but I see how much it hurts her." He paused, his voice breaking slightly. "I haven't seen her this happy in years. You gave her that. In 5 minutes, you gave her something I've been trying to give her my whole life." Grace didn't know what to say. She was just a waitress. She hadn't done anything special. She'd just used the language Tommy taught her, the language of love and attention and truly seeing someone. But maybe that was the point. Maybe that was everything. Word spread fast through the Grand Pearl restaurant. The other waiters had noticed the unusual scene at table 7. They'd watched Grace signing, watched the older woman's face light up, watched the powerful businessman sitting quietly with tears in his eyes. During their break, everyone wanted to know what had happened. "I just used sign language with a guest," Grace explained quietly, uncomfortable with the attention. "That was Julian Rivera," one of the senior waiters said, his eyes wide. "Do you know who he is? He owns half the buildings downtown. He's worth hundreds of millions of dollars. People wait months to get meetings with him." Grace shrugged. "He's just a son taking his mother to lunch." But the manager saw something else. She'd been watching the whole interaction, and she'd seen something rare in this business: genuine human connection. After table 7 left, after Julian had left a tip that was more than Grace made in a month, after Catherine had hugged Grace 3 more times, the manager called Grace into her office. Grace walked in nervously, sure she was about to be reprimanded for spending too much time at one table, for crying during her shift, for being unprofessional. "Sit down, Grace," the manager said, but her voice was gentle, not angry. Grace sat, hands folded in her lap, waiting. "What you did today," the manager began, "that's what hospitality really means. It's not just about bringing food to tables. It's about seeing people, really seeing them. You saw that woman not as a complication or a difficulty, but as a person who needed connection. That's rare." She paused, then smiled. "You're not in trouble. I wanted to tell you that you did something beautiful today." Grace felt relief wash over her, followed by something she hadn't felt in years: pride. But the story doesn't end there. That evening, Grace returned to her tiny apartment, exhausted but feeling something different inside. Lighter, maybe. Less hollow. She'd spent 2 years avoiding anything that reminded her of Tommy, including sign language. It hurt too much. But today, using Tommy's language, connecting with Catherine, it hadn't just been painful. It had been healing. She didn't know that across the city, in a penthouse apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows, Julian Rivera was having dinner with his mother and talking about her. "I want to do something for that young woman," Catherine signed to her son. "She gave me such a gift today." Julian nodded. He'd been thinking the same thing. "What do you suggest?" Catherine thought for a moment, then signed. "She said her brother died 2 years ago. She's young, probably struggling. I saw her uniform, it wasn't new. I saw her shoes, they've been repaired multiple times. She's working hard but barely getting by." Catherine's hands moved with determination. "She has a gift, Julian. The ability to connect with people like me, to bridge the gap between the hearing world and the deaf world. That's valuable. That's important. We should help her use that gift." Julian understood immediately. His mother was right. Grace had something special, not just the ability to sign, but the compassion and understanding that came from lived experience. People with that combination were rare. "I'll make some calls," Julian said. 3 days later, Grace was called into the manager's office again. This time, Julian Rivera was there, sitting in a chair, dressed in another expensive suit. Grace's heart started pounding. Had she done something wrong? Was he here to complain? "Please sit down, Grace," Julian said gently. "You're not in trouble. I promise." Grace sat, confused and nervous. "My mother hasn't stopped talking about you since Thursday," Julian began. "She told everyone we know about the waitress who took the time to really see her, to speak her language. She's been deaf her whole life, and she's met thousands of people. But she said you were different. Do you know why?" Grace shook her head. "Because you didn't just sign at her. You signed with her. There's a difference. You connected with her as a person, not as a problem to solve." Julian leaned forward. "I did some research on you. I hope you don't mind. I learned about your brother, about your mother, about your situation. And I learned that you dropped out of college when your brother got sick. You were studying education, weren't you?" Grace nodded, surprised he knew. "I wanted to be a teacher," she said softly. "Specifically, a special education teacher. I wanted to work with deaf children. But when Tommy got sick, I had to leave school to help pay for his treatments and take care of my mother." "What if you could go back?" Julian asked. "What if you could finish your degree?" Grace almost laughed, but it came out bitter. "That's impossible. I can barely afford rent. College costs tens of thousands of dollars. I'd need scholarships, financial aid, and even then, I'd have to work full-time. There's no way." "What if there was a way?" Julian pulled out an envelope from his jacket pocket. "My mother and I have a foundation. We fund education for young people who have experienced hardship, but show exceptional character and potential. We'd like to offer you a full scholarship to finish your degree in special education. Tuition, books, living expenses, everything covered. You could focus entirely on your studies." Grace stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. "I don't understand. Why would you do this?" "Because you gave my mother something priceless," Julian said simply. "You gave her dignity. You gave her joy. You gave her 2 hours where she didn't feel like a burden or an afterthought. And you did it without expecting anything in return. That kind of character is worth investing in." Grace's hands started shaking. "I can't accept this. It's too much. I'm nobody. I'm just—" "You're not nobody," Julian interrupted firmly. "You're exactly the kind of person who should be teaching. You understand what it means to be different, to struggle, to feel invisible. That makes you valuable. That makes you necessary." Grace couldn't sleep that night. The envelope sat on her tiny desk, unopened, like it might disappear if she looked away too long. A full scholarship. A chance to finish college. A chance to become the teacher she'd always dreamed of being. It felt impossible, like a dream she was afraid to believe in, because believing made it hurt more when it turned out to be untrue. But the next morning, the envelope was still there. And when she opened it, everything inside was real. Acceptance letters. Financial documents. A personal note from Catherine, written in English but also accompanied by photos of her signing. "Use Tommy's gift to help other children. Make sure they never feel alone the way I sometimes have. You have that power now. Don't waste it." Grace sat on her bed and cried. Not sad tears this time. These were different. These were tears of hope, of possibility, of feeling like maybe, just maybe, all the pain and struggle had been leading somewhere after all. Within a month, Grace enrolled back in college. She kept working part-time at the Grand Pearl, but now her shifts were planned around her classes. She studied special education with a focus on deaf education, and everything she learned felt personal, felt important, felt like honoring Tommy's memory in a way that mattered. Catherine became something like a grandmother to Grace. They met for lunch once a month, always at the Grand Pearl, always at table 7. They'd spend hours signing together, talking about everything and nothing. Catherine shared stories about growing up deaf in the 1950s and 60s, before sign language was widely accepted, before accommodations were common. Grace shared her dreams about opening a school one day, a place where deaf children could learn in their own language without feeling less than. "You'll do it," Catherine signed confidently. "I know you will." Julian, for his part, stayed quietly in the background. But Grace noticed small things. Textbooks she needed would mysteriously appear at the restaurant, already paid for. When her apartment's heating broke in winter, it was fixed within hours through a maintenance company owned by Julian's development firm. He never made a big deal about any of it. He just made sure Grace could focus on what mattered. 2 years later, Grace graduated at the top of her class. Catherine and Julian were there in the audience, signing applause when Grace walked across the stage to receive her diploma. Grace's mother was there too, sober for 6 months now, crying proud tears. Grace had helped her get into treatment, using some of the living expense money from her scholarship. Healing, Grace had learned, often happened in circles, not straight lines. Grace got a job at a school for deaf children across the city. On her first day, walking into a classroom full of young students who communicated with their hands instead of their voices, Grace felt Tommy's presence so strongly it almost knocked her over. This was what he would have wanted. This was how his life, as short as it was, could mean something beyond his death. She became known as one of the best teachers at the school. Not because she was the most technically skilled, but because she understood her students in a way textbooks couldn't teach. She understood what it felt like to be on the outside. She understood the frustration of a world not built for you. She understood the joy of finding someone who truly sees you. Years passed. Grace saved money and eventually helped open a community center that offered free sign language classes to hearing families with deaf children. She wanted to make sure no child ever felt as isolated as Tommy had sometimes felt, and no family ever struggled as much as hers had to communicate with each other. Catherine volunteered at the center every week, teaching classes to parents and grandparents who were learning to sign. At 78 years old, she'd found a new purpose, helping others navigate the world she'd lived in her entire life. One evening, after a particularly good class where a father successfully signed his first full conversation with his deaf daughter, Catherine and Grace sat together in the empty center, drinking tea. "Do you ever think about that day?" Catherine signed. "The day we met?" Grace nodded. "All the time. It changed everything." "No," Catherine signed, shaking her head with a smile. "You changed everything. I was just lucky enough to be sitting at table 7. Grace smiled back. "We were both lucky. Sometimes I think Tommy sent you to me. Like he knew I needed a reason to remember that his life mattered, that our language mattered, that everything we shared wasn't just gone." "It was never gone," Catherine signed. "Love doesn't disappear, Grace. It just changes shape. Tommy's love became your compassion. Your compassion became that scholarship. That scholarship became this center. This center will help hundreds of families. Thousands maybe. That's not gone. That's immortal." Grace felt tears on her cheeks, but she was smiling. Catherine was right. Tommy hadn't just died and left nothing behind. He'd left Grace. He'd left their shared language. He'd left the ability to see people like Catherine and understand their world. He'd left a ripple that kept spreading outward, touching lives he'd never meet, helping people he'd never know. That night, walking home under streetlights, Grace thought about how one afternoon, one gesture, one moment of choosing to see someone fully had changed the trajectory of her entire life. She thought about how easily she could have just taken Catherine's order without signing, how she could have stayed invisible and safe and separate. She thought about how close she'd come to keeping Tommy's language locked away forever because it hurt too much to use it. But pain, Grace had learned, wasn't something to avoid. It was something to move through, to transform, to use as fuel for something better. Her pain had become her purpose. Her loss had become her gift. And Tommy, sweet Tommy who never heard a single sound in his whole life, had somehow managed to speak to the world through her hands, through her heart, through every life she touched. The story doesn't end here because stories like this never really end. They just keep rippling outward, wave after wave, touching shores we'll never see, changing lives in ways we'll never fully know. And somewhere, Grace liked to believe, Tommy was watching. Not with his eyes, which had closed too soon, but with something deeper. And he was proud. If this story touched your heart, remember that kindness doesn't require grand gestures or wealth or power. Sometimes it just requires paying attention. Seeing people. Really seeing them. That's where everything begins. That's where everything changes. One moment. One gesture. One person choosing compassion. That's all it takes to change the world.